everyone. My name is Zach Doering, and for my BSI research project, I studied how to build community resiliency against disasters. I had two main research questions during this project. Firstly, how is the vulnerability and resiliency of communities and locations constructed, and how do they shape the harm experienced by those communities? And secondly, how can the resiliency of communities and locations be raised to either lessen or fully prevent disasters from occurring? I had a couple parts of the framework that I used to analyze the different sites I studied and come up with recommendations to raise the resiliency of each of these sites and overall locations in the future. Firstly, is my personal working recommendation or personal definition of a disaster, which is a disruptive collision between human society and the surrounding environment. When most people hear disaster, they think of natural disaster. Just a hurricane happens, an earthquake, a tsunami. This is misleading for two specific reasons. Firstly, disaster is defined by situational damage. It's about how it affects us as people. If a hurricane happens and forms in the middle of the ocean and it stays there, we don't consider that a disaster. Like Hurricane Katrina in 2005, if it sweeps across the southeastern part of the United States, hitting the city like New Orleans, destroying people's homes, killing people, that is a disaster. The second reason it's not natural is because of human-caused climate change. We are burning fossil fuels, emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, raising the global temperature, which increases the severity of these events, these forces, and the frequency of these forces that eventually turn into disasters. I had two other terms that I used throughout this research. Firstly is vulnerability, which is the collection of forces and variables that amplify harm in the case of a disruptive event. And secondly is resiliency, which is the collection of forces and variables that reduce or prevent harm in the case of a disruptive event. At face value, these seem like opposite definitions. If you raise resiliency, vulnerability will be lowered. It's not that simple though. You could raise the resiliency of the location based on how you implement those actions. It could actually make the communities there more vulnerable. When we're trying to figure out solutions for each of these sites and locations in general, we have to be very specific and very knowledgeable and connected to the places that we're talking about and we're working in, so we aren't taking two steps back when we attempt to take one step forward. I studied 6 sites during this research project. The Detroit flooding during the summer of 2021, the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead drought, which started in 2021 and is continuing now, the Kentucky tornadoes during the winter of 2021, the Texas power outage, which hit in February of 2021, Hurricane Ida, which hit Mississippi and Louisiana in 2021, and the New Mexico wildfires that started this year and are continuing now. I want you to recognize 2 things about all of these sites. Firstly, they've either all happened very recently or they're continuing now. I wanted to choose sites that are as accurate to our current climate crisis as possible so that for the recommendations for these sites that I come up with, it can be as effective to how we need to be combating these issues. And secondly, these are 6 completely different types of weather events and disasters. A lot of times people will come up with recommendations for flood sites, for tornado sites. I wanted to come up with recommendations that can apply to a wide variety and array of sites so that it's not just specified to one community and one type of disaster. I'm going to talk about 2 of the sites that I studied with you today. The first one is the Texas power outage that happened in February of 2021. Going back about 2 decades, Texas deregulated its electricity market, which made it easier and cheaper to electrify natural gas. It seemed like a great idea at the time. They created a dual reliant system of natural gas and electricity. You need one to power the other and keep the grid and heating systems working. The winter storm hits in February and it starts to freeze these natural gas wells. It starts to freeze the roads. Because of these frozen gas wells, you have less natural gas being extracted. And because of the frozen roads, trucks can't drive that natural gas to power plants. Now there's less electricity generation. Texas is at the brink of a blackout. They have a certain amount of demand, and their electricity supply is slowly lowering further and further. Texas starts to make energy cuts in order to prevent a full-on blackout from happening. During this time, though, they started to cut energy to natural gas producing facilities because they were not registered as critical structures. This list includes hospitals, government buildings, structures that under no circumstances should have their power cut because they are vital to the state of Texas. So, in this goal of preventing a blackout, when you start to cut these buildings that produce natural gas, which is used to generate electricity, Texas goes to a full-on blackout. And now you have millions of homes that don't have electricity and don't have heat in the middle of the winter. The entire system is set up so that if one thing goes wrong, everything collapses. And whether people realize it or not, we only start seeing people talk about it in case of a serious event like this when people start to get hurt. The second event I'm going to talk about is Detroit flooding during the summer of 2021. I was working in Detroit when this happened. I personally drove through this at 6:30 in the morning, so it's a little personal for me. First off, Detroit has serious rainfall in all 3 months of the summer, in June, July, and August. The city has a 2-inch water threshold, meaning that when it rains, if rainfall is above 2 inches, there are serious flooding problems. Throughout those 3 months, Detroit had over 15 inches of rainfall. One specific July storm was recorded at 2.2 inches, and a group of August storms were recorded at almost 3 inches. This led to multiple feet of flooding. You can see in this picture here, the highway is being flooded. Cars are almost fully covered in water, and they can't go anywhere. At the same time during these storms, it knocked out the power lines, cutting power out to most parts of Detroit. So people, their basements start to flood, they don't have electricity, most of their cars are either so covered in water they can't drive, or they're being carried down to other parts of the street. It's a serious problem. Now, leading up to these rainstorms, the Great Lakes Water Authority, which is the organization in charge of managing flooding so that it doesn't get out of its hand, said that the flood system was working as designed and it could handle the expected rainwater. Obviously, that didn't happen. This was the case for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the 2 main pump stations that were in charge of pumping this water out of the city at an effective rate had power issues. Power wasn't being sent to them consistently, so only 8 out of the 14 pumps were working during these storms. That's barely over half. It was decided that though these pumps did not, on their own, create these flooding problems, they did increase the intensity of the flooding and how long the flooding lasted. This statement gives 2 important points that need to be identified. Firstly, the pumps are crucial to reducing the damage the damage of flooding, the consisting of flooding that's caused during these rainfall events. Secondly, because of that 2-inch water threshold, there's going to be flooding either way. So the flooding infrastructure, flooding mitigation in the city of Detroit needs to change, because one way or the other, whether the pumps are working or not, there are going to be issues. During this time as well, water prices rose from 1.5 to 10% for these communities that were having these flooding problems. It was deemed that this happened so that based on the amount of rainfall the city got, the water treatment facilities could be paid for so that they could manage the water. So these homes, these families where they experience this flooding because the city can't handle it, they have to pay for that, and then on the back end, they have to pay so that the city can manage that water after the time it's too late. I have 3 groups of recommendations to raise the resiliency of each of the sites that I studied, as well as sites overall in going forward. Firstly is to protect and strengthen power systems. Secondly is to empower preparation and response at local city and community levels. And the third one is the idea of international climate refugees and whether to rebuild or relocate. I'm going to get into each of these briefly. First group is protecting power systems. There are 2 main ways to do this. Firstly is to move utilities underground. Fortified tunnels have been found to provide higher resistance against all types of weather events, including hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, tornadoes. They protect the power systems so that they don't fail. In many of the cases that I studied, including Detroit, a lot of the issues came because those grid systems were collapsed when some weather event happened. These resistant tunnels provide better protection against that, to hopefully protect the power grid as a whole. And secondly is to transition to sustainable and independent energy sources. It's important that we pay attention to both of these. Renewable resources, such as wind and solar, are great. The sun's always going to be there, the wind is always going to be there. But some renewable resources aren't sustainable. Hydroelectric power, in the case of the Lake Mead and Hoover Dam drought, they have a hydroelectric dam. But as the temperature increases, as that water is evaporating, it's not producing as much electricity. That's no longer sustainable. Fossil fuels, not sustainable, not renewable at all. They're making climate change worse, so we have to stop burning them. Also, renewable energy has become be more resilient against disasters. In the case of Texas, their entire grid system relies on natural gas as the starting point, and if that falters, everything collapses. If you have renewable energies, if one starts to falter, the others can make up for it and supplement so that the entire grid isn't put under enough stress so that it breaks. The next group of improvements is about community empowerment. Local levels allow for more planning and focus where it's needed. Local leaders know their communities and they're already on the ground. FEMA has to deal with every single disaster that happens in the United States. That's a lot to deal with. If you have these local communities established and working within their areas, they can do so much of the work that FEMA normally has to travel and do hours after an event occurs, days, even months. All the sites that I studied had poverty rates that were higher than the national average, meaning that these groups were highly vulnerable. They don't have the resources on their own to deal with these events and recover properly afterward. Detroit has an almost 80% Black population, and the site of Hurricane Ida, which is Louisiana and Mississippi, had Black populations of 30%. These communities are even more vulnerable. You have to deal with environmental racism. You have to deal with all of these different hoops that they have to jump through that white people don't have to. So on top of them being in poverty, they have to do so much more. This shouldn't be the case. They get less focused treatment by large organizations because it's so hard to give that, to pay attention to that. If you have these local organizations on the ground, they can know what their community's needs are before an event even happens and start to prepare for it. The issue with this, though, is that they don't have the resources. A large organization like FEMA, they have the resources, and that's why we normally go to them first. If FEMA were to direct these resources to these communities who are already established, who are doing the work that we know needs to be done, they can be so more effective. And overall, it's better for FEMA because they have less work that they have to do anyway. The third category of improvements is whether to rebuild or relocate. When most people hear the term climate refugees, they think of international climate refugees, people having to move from one country to another because where they were living is no longer livable. But especially in the United States, we're becoming more common with a term called international climate refugees. People have to move within their nation from one state to another. This is specifically becoming more common on the western part of the United States where wildfires are occurring. Some people have to leave their homes for over 2 years because it's not livable. And some people have now had to start permanently relocating. As sea levels rise due to climate change, the shores are starting to go inward and we're losing more land every single year. Both of these options, rebuilding and relocating, can be effective, but only if they're done in the right situation. Relocation is more effective for small communities. You don't have to move large structures and you don't have to move large populations. A small group of people and you can move them to where they need to go. But rebuilding is more effective for cities. It's way too expensive to move large structures and move large groups of people. Those resources should be spent elsewhere because they can do more good. In both of these cases, though, there are certain values that need to be at the forefront of these actions. Firstly, financial responsibility needs to be put on organizations and governments when this happens. It's not fair to say to people, you can move if you want to, but you have to pay for it, you have to set your life somewhere else, because they're not the ones that cause climate change, but they're just the ones being affected. So for these people that have these large amounts of resources, they need to be the ones pushing that financial aspect, supporting people to make decisions where they want to. But they can't be the ones saying that people have to move. Communities should have that decision-making power and that agentive aspect of it. It's not fair for cities to say, we're going to put up a flood wall, all these communities here, you have to move because we decide where it should go. Those communities are there, they need to decide whether that's something they want to do or not. So the financial aspect and responsibility needs to be put on large organizations, but people still need to be able to decide how it's used and in what cases. To recap all of these conclusions, move power lines underground, it protects them from weather events. Move to sustainable and independent energy sources that can be more resilient and work better within this moving world of climate change. social justice needs to be at the forefront of all of these actions, or else we're going to be hurting people more than we're helping them. Local community empowerment is crucial to making all of this effective. Working at smaller scales creates large change overall rather than trying to solve a large problem right away. Acting upon relocation and rebuilding in the right situations will be effective for every situation where it's used. The goal is to increase resiliency overall without increasing the vulnerability of any communities. If these are done in the right situations, that will be achieved. And finally, the proper responsibility and agency needs to be put in with the right people. Communities should have decision-making power, but they shouldn't have to put up the resources to make those decisions. Climate change isn't going to go anywhere. It's only going to get worse. We need to focus on building the resiliency of communities and locations so that hopefully we survive climate change, and hopefully not just survive, but can actually enjoy life and thrive. But the focus needs to be on these vulnerable communities who they didn't decide this, they didn't create climate change, but they're the ones that are having to deal with it. Thank you. Absolutely. So, I mean, you see things like the Black Lives Matter movement, other environmental justice movements, they're done at local city levels. And so you have something national like the Black Lives Matter movement, which, is grown on Twitter, but that's still effective at very small levels. So you have an overarching brand name to it, but it's where communities decide, we need to do work here, we're going to join together and get it done. It's happened. I mean, especially the environmental justice movement in the past 20 years, that's how it's been so effective. And there are already communities doing that. It's not like they need to start it now. It's more they just need more support because the funding and the resources is where they're lacking because they're at such small levels. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by the idea of moving the power line underground essentially. If that would work so much better and be that more funded, why has it not worked?
The biggest thing is initially it's a lot of upfront cost. Over time, it's going to save so much money in terms of the destruction that resources could cost if it wasn't underground, that people don't want to give up the money specifically governments because it costs so much. There's one specific gas company that is working to move about 10,000 miles of power lines underground in wildfire-prone areas of California. That's the most recent large-scale example of this happening. It's a fairly recent idea, so hopefully this gains more ground. But at least initially with renewable energy, that's not the case anymore. But the upfront cost was so much more that people didn't want to give up that money. Large organizations, governments didn't want to. So hopefully this gains more traction, becomes more affordable. But the economics already make sense now as long as you have the money. Yeah.
So I don't know if you come across this because this is a more abstract kind of details we were looking at, but in a lot of different fields like ecology or even people who study things like airports and stuff, or even genetics, for example, is what they call network theory and stuff like that, right? How things are connected through nodes and sort of and you can approach like what keeps a system or a network stable by looking at all those connections. And in a sense, I think a lot of what you're describing could be addressed in those kinds of ways. And then there's a tension though, because the Texas thing you described is sort of a case where you had a problem where you had a node, right? That one thing. So you could expand the resiliency of the network, right, by having different pathways. Then you start to get redundancy. From a politician's perspective, hey, what if we were to have like multiple ways or 5 of these things? Then it starts to get more expensive. I was just curious if in any of this work you can come across this idea of network.
I've studied a little bit before, not specifically in this case, but the idea of redundancy. That's definitely something that comes up in Texas. You can pay for setups that everything's working in one system, but since it is, and people want to do it, it's just, I think it's easy to look at it in that simple system if they don't have like a network perspective or something like that. So hopefully that's becoming more a part of people's literature, the way they're viewing problems. But I mean, yeah, it's just hard to say, I think, but that's definitely needed, because if you can do things more efficiently, that's great. But if you have, like you're saying, a breaking point where something goes wrong and everything falls apart, that needs to be identified before. Any other questions?